Good morning. It's indeed a pleasure for me to make this introduction. Australia's section has been always special to Singapore, not just because of the proximity. Well, it's not that near, but we are in the same region, the Indo-Pacific region. But more than that, Australia has been always very supportive of the Singapore Lodge. And I've known Linda for quite a while now. Linda has been a member since 1971, and she has held various positions in the Australian section and is currently its national president. She served as the international vice president of the Theosophical Society from October 2008 until late 2011. 2.5 years of this period was spent at ADIA, the Society's international headquarters in India, before she returned to live in Sydney. Her arts degree at the Australian National University focused on humanities and political science. She has given presentations for the TS in various countries, and her writings have been published in a number of TS journals. And this morning, she's going to talk about contemplative living in a modern world. Could you join me in welcoming Linda to the plenum? Okay.
They say that the spiritual path is razor-edged. Perhaps giving a talk can be too. This is going to be quite a delicate balancing act to keep the earpieces in place, so please forgive me if I adjust this a bit along the way. Respected President, brothers and sisters near and far, this morning we are going to consider one aspect of the theme of this Congress, and that is contemplation, specifically contemplative living in the modern world. So here we are on planet Earth, which is quite extraordinary. We live on this planet which is a veritable jewel floating through the vastness of space. A jewel which provides a home for a tremendous diversity of life forms. In its natural state, Earth is extraordinarily beautiful, with vast tracts of ocean, silent deserts, majestic mountains, glistening giant masses of ice, convulsing volcanoes, great big underwater and underground worlds, celestial skies, extraordinary animal and bird life, and verdant vegetation. So there is our beautiful planet. And then there is us. What happens when you superimpose humankind upon this scenario? For one thing, you have the potential for massive change to this precious jewel. Humans have been the harbinger of substantial change to this planet. Why is this? Perhaps it really comes down to manas, this thinking principle, which is a unique gift that we have as humans, but also our greatest challenge. It is a gift because the mind's potential is almost limitless. And it is the transformed mind that enables our ultimate liberation from the wheel of birth and death, or birth and rebirth more accurately. But in the meantime, the mind is also our greatest challenge. This is because in the first place, the stronger the mind, the stronger the sense of I. And therefore also the stronger the sense or tendency towards selfishness, self-importance, and even of supremacy over other life forms. Also, inevitably due to the apparently limitless creativity of human thought, numerous life forms in our natural world have been damaged or, worse still, annihilated. Furthermore, humans are social creatures. Sometimes this social noise becomes such a preoccupation that our spiritual roots are forgotten, or else scant attention is given to the spiritual pole of our being. For these kinds of reasons, planet Earth becomes our playground for many self-centered interests. Buildings replace natural habitats more and more. Similarly, our disregard for the planet and the life around us replaces an active and caring relationship with life and a genuine spiritual connection. However, preferring more of a daily spiritual connection, for millennia some individuals have chosen to live a particular kind of life which binds them back on a daily basis to the source of being, to God or Brahman or Tao, if you like. This inevitably requires the sacrifice of certain worldly things and the adoption of a specific, simple way of living in some kind of cloistered, that is, sheltered or semi-cloistered environment. A keen sense of life's depth, a devotion to that whom many call God, along with a wish to adopt a dedicated and spiritual or religious mode of life, has driven a small proportion of people to gather together in various contemplative communities. Some kind of inner calling has spoken to them, perhaps also to some people in this audience at some point in their life. Monastic communities have existed and continue to exist within great religious traditions of the world, of course. One website speaks of contemplative communities in the United States which live, quote, on islands and in forests, behind churches on busy highways, and among working class homes on urban streets. Communities which are, quote, obedience to a discipline of prayer. And we heard a comprehensive talk yesterday by Sister Lily about prayer. We also have, of course, a number of theosophical communities around the world today, including our wonderful international headquarters, which help provide an environment in which reflection on life's deeper truths may flourish. So what, therefore, are the characteristics of a contemplative community? Well, here is one description. A contemplative community is characterized by simplicity and by helping others to realize the depth of their human connection with God and all of creation, nourished daily by a rhythm of prayer and work and leisure. So there's a daily rhythm inherent in living in a contemplative community. The website from which this came states, to be a contemplative, and everyone has a built-in capacity to be one. I think that's interesting. Everyone has a built-in capacity to be a contemplative. We must come to a profound self-knowledge that is both frightening and liberating. A profound self-knowledge that is both frightening and liberating. It says, we learn to surrender and yield to a God whom we cannot understand most of the time, but dare to trust. We can note some key points here about what it means to be a contemplative. Liberating self-knowledge, surrender to or trust in a greater power. We'll come back to contemplation a bit later on and go into it more deeply. So, what are those people who have a definite leaning towards contemplation, but whose life, for various reasons, has to be lived in the everyday world? That probably applies to most of us here, to many, many TS members around the world. In order to consider this question, we need to ask 3 further questions. First of all, what is contemplation? Secondly, what does it mean to adopt a contemplative life? And thirdly, how is it possible to live in a more contemplative way in the everyday world? And the how question is extremely important because it relates to the way in which we live, practically speaking. Theory needs to be transformed into practice, or else it does not serve a very useful purpose. This applies as much to theosophy as to any other area of life. So, what is contemplation? The word derives from the Latin contemplatio, act of looking at, in turn from contemplary, to gaze attentively, observe, consider. Originally, in fact, to mark out a space for observation. So from what we have noted so far, it can be seen that contemplation requires, shall we say, deep reflection, a dedicated mental space, which we create deliberately for this purpose, attentive observation to whatever is within our line of vision, as it were, and also, ultimately, it's really a mode of awareness which leads to a profound self-knowledge. So it's also useful and helpful to consider this subject in the context of meditation. And this is because the meditative process is in itself a multi-stage undertaking. We may not necessarily think of that way, but I suppose when the analytical mind comes into play, it can be seen that meditation is something which deepens our awareness more and more. The Indian sage Patanjali gave a number of instructions for meditation, which are quite well known and are used in the yogic tradition. So he talked about 8 stages of yoga, the first 4 being yama or restraint, niyama, observance. There was a set of each of those, asana, postures, pranayama, regulating the breath. But then he had further stages which are specific to meditation practice, and the first 3, in a sense, indicate what is required before we can come to a state of contemplation. So we have pratyahara, we will go into these, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So let us begin with pratyahara, which is a really beautiful concept. It's often regarded as something like the withdrawal of consciousness from the senses. That doesn't make us senseless. It's a different kind of withdrawal from the senses. We do tend to be sense-driven beings. Our thought processes are largely dominated by sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. We're therefore also driven by those desires and aversions which frequently are fueled by the senses. And we can see this at work in daily living. For example, we see a favourite kind of ice cream. What happens? We would like to try some. What happens when we finish? We'd like to have some more. Or perhaps we hear some appealing music and then we have a desire to hear more such music. Or we may eat something which tastes unpleasant and therefore we have an aversion to that kind of food. Or we smell something we do not like and recoil. Therefore, the effect of the activity of the senses on the mental and emotional fields may be far stronger and more frequent than we could even imagine, until we become aware by observing what is actually happening. On the other hand, pratyahara is a very calming process, helping to prepare for deeper meditation. It requires the senses to be focused and used in a particular way. One could think that pratyahara applies only to the beginning of formal, regular meditation practice. However, Venerable Professor Samdong Rinpoche made a significant and perhaps surprising statement, which is that the necessary calming down is achieved not through meditation, but by living an ordinary, routine life. So for him, pratyahara, that calming down, is really part and parcel of living an ordinary, routine life. There's an elegant simplicity in this. There's a very recent and practical example, and one which probably everybody here in this room will not forget during their lifetime, because it made some very gripping news recently. This was the recent dramatic unfoldments of events surrounding a soccer team and their coach who were trapped in a cave in Thailand. And this really gripped people for quite a few days until the boys were all released. Now, what was it that helped the boys to stay calm while they were trapped in the cave? Well, they were basically taught, more than anything else, pratyahara by their coach, who fortuitously happened to be a former novice Buddhist monk. He, it is said, quote, helped keep the boys breathing and emotionally balanced during the crisis, and also readied them for their hours-long treacherous escape, guided by expert cave divers. It was an extraordinary story, wasn't it? And in the process, he gave them the vital tools that they needed, specifically teaching them how to tap into their own tranquility and inner stillness. He taught them how to keep themselves calm, a minor but magnificent distinction, said the Washington Post. So that was pratyahara, just learning to remain calm. And these boys must have had a very different experience in that cave through being taught how to remain calm than they would have had if they had a coach who really did not have the skills to help to bring out the best in them. So pratyahara is a very, very important thing. Then we come to dharana, usually translated into English as concentration. In concentration, we try to understand and control the mind so that it no longer acts restlessly. This has been described by Adelaide Gardner as a technical re-education of the lower mind so that it becomes obedient to the self. A technical re-education of the lower mind. We can think of dharana, therefore, as an antidote to the monkey mind, with which I'm sure everybody is familiar. And through dharana, we can direct steady attention towards anything, even something that has no appeal whatsoever to the observer. Did you ever find yourself in school studying something in which you had no interest at all? A great test of dharana is whether it's possible to actually focus on that, concentrate on that, learn to concentrate on the things that we really aren't interested in, perhaps don't like. So when we concentrate, then we're holding the mind to a single idea at will. And this could be any physical object, any particular idea, a virtue or whatever. And basically everything else is excluded so that the will is brought to bear on the mind. And when concentration wanders, returning to the breath has been found to be highly beneficial. So breath and concentration have a relationship. We concentrate better if the breath is steady. There's a Zen story on meditation which really brings out the need for the mind to become settled. "Why must I meditate in order to achieve enlightenment?" demanded the prince of his teacher. "I can study, I can pray, I can think on issues clearly. Why this silly emptying of the mind?" "I will show you," said the teacher, taking a bucket of water into the garden under the full moon. "Now I stir the surface, and what do you see?" "Ribbons of light," answered the prince. "Now wait," said the teacher, setting the bucket down. Both teacher and boy watched the calming surface of the water in the bamboo bucket for many minutes. "Now what do you see?" asked the teacher. "The moon," replied the prince. "So too, young master, the only way to grasp enlightenment is through a calm and settled mind." The stirred up water in the bucket mentioned in this story is like an image of the everyday human mind, which is all too frequently distracted. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper to dhyana, usually or often translated as meditation into English. And meditation in earnest really starts when active thought ceases and one becomes aware of the inner meaning of the object of meditation. There is an uninterrupted flow of the mind towards that object of meditation. Ernest Wood has actually described meditation as a flow into the object, not past it. So we have subtler mental activity invoked during meditation itself. And there's just one concept which is experienced with all its riches. We experience the essential nature of meditation, Adelaide Gardner mentioned this, like a tune or sung or a wind blowing over the soul. That's rather lovely, isn't it? Like a tune sung or a wind blowing over the soul. In other words, meditation is refreshing. It can and does transform the mind each time it is experienced, even just a little. The stage of dhyana or meditation is beautiful and profound, but yet this is still not contemplation. The word normally used for contemplation in the Eastern traditions is samadhi, used in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, schools of yoga, etc. And in this final stage, the meditator becomes one with the object of meditation. There is only a consciousness of that object. And this results in an expansion of consciousness. So instead of narrowing down, it actually opens right up. And it lifts one out of the little self into the greater self. One is open to and feels unity with one life, the one life. Patanjali referred to this as the return of the power of pure consciousness to its essential form. The return of the power of pure consciousness to its essential form. That's really profound. This condition is practically beyond verbal description, but we're actually going to consider some comments that have made about contemplation to try to have a fuller understanding of it. So, yes, it is difficult to convey in everyday language. Maybe it can be thought of as pure awareness, not self-awareness, but simply pure awareness. An experience of awareness without any sense of self. Or we could think of it as union with the divine, with that which is sacred. In the Monier-Williams Sanskrit dictionary, contemplation or samadhi in this case is described as putting together, joining, completion, accomplishment, conclusion, intense contemplation of any particular object meditated upon. So this adds some further nuances to the term contemplation. There's a certain intensity and a wholeness about the experience. I don't know if anybody here knew Helen Zahara, who along with Joy Mills founded Quest Books in the USA. She was also a General Secretary of the Australian section. She had something to say about contemplation. She wrote, "In that moment of absorption there may come a stillness of the mind which is not negative or passive, but is dynamic and alert. This is the state of contemplation. Now it is suggested that the object of meditation should be dropped altogether from the mind, while the mind remains in that still, absorbed, poised state of consciousness. The mind is now emptied of image and forms, so there's an emptiness about this. And in that moment, it is free and open to receive intimations from the inner world of the self, to experience intuition, buddhi. To use a well-known analogy, the mind is like a clear, placid lake, able to reflect the divine consciousness from within. In that state of contemplation, which is a state of consciousness beyond form, the individual can have spiritual insight, which, however brief, can transform his understanding, can expand his awareness, this is still the quote from Helen Zahara, lifting him out of his usually limited field of vision into a new vision and a realization of the deeper reality which exists within." While describing the state of contemplation is always limited by words, its effects are clear enough. It is transformative, it is expansive, there is a new vision of a deeper reality. A number of people have written about stages of samadhi. This morning we're going to consider some stages which were mentioned by Evelyn Underhill in the book Practical Mysticism, with which some of you might be familiar. She identified 3 forms or stages of contemplation, each one deeper than before. So just as meditation is a multi-stage process, so is contemplation in effect, because one can go into deeper states of contemplation. So the first one she mentioned was pouring oneself into life forms, into multiplicity with the eye of contemplation. It involves a loving and patient exploration of the world, widening the consciousness until one feels every manifestation of life as the expression of God. Could you imagine gazing at a cockroach so deeply that the manifestation of that little creature as an expression of God is completely understood? So gazing at the multiplicity of life, but seeing them with the eye of contemplation, is something that really brings us back to unity. That there is really fundamentally no difference between life forms at an interior level. One realizes, said Evelyn Underwood, the movement of lila, the sport or the play of God. And this can be done practically through stretching the will towards one of the many manifestations of life around you and pouring yourself towards it, to use Evelyn Underhill's words. She spoke of looking with the eye of contemplation to determine the celestial quality of something. Even the most dissipated tabby cat on the streets. From this, she asserted, old barriers will vanish. And this is really seeing everything with an absolutely equal eye, something which is so difficult to do when one is functioning in what we would call the lower mind or the technical mind. A veritable condition of awareness, a direct perception. And then she said it is necessary to surrender oneself, to absorb. So this first stage of contemplation for her involves seeing every life form with the eye of contemplation. Then we come to the second stage, finding and feeling the eternal. She uses a plant as an example of something with which you might have direct communication, or communion rather, and perhaps those of you who are gardeners will relate to this. There's a tremendous joy in communing with one's plants as they grow. But this really requires our consciousness of deeper realities, this stage. She said, you will now find and feel the infinite and eternal. In the first stage, there was a deliberate inward retreat and gathering together of one's faculties, but now attention is directed towards a plane of existence in which the bodily senses have no attachments. So the senses have completely disappeared in that sense. There is an intense and vivid silence, she said. You have plunged into darkness, the cloud of unknowing. To some, this brings joy and peace, to others even fear. With control of attention, she said, the trained contemplative can recapture this state of awareness again and again. And then we come to the third form of contemplation she identified. I've just used the word effortlessness for this. Up until now, effort has been involved. But she then wrote of the contemplator letting go with no striving and pushing, dwelling quietly in this place of darkness, St. John of the Cross's Night of the Spirit. And this is reminiscent of the aspects of the self to be killed, which are mentioned in Light on the Path, for those who are familiar with this little spiritual guidebook. Evelyn Underhill wrote, union with reality can only be a union of love. So love comes into contemplation very much. She talked about yielding to unmeasured love. She said you must die into or melt into the whole. From this self-surrender, you will be reborn into another world. What was felt as emptiness before is now a mighty energy or vitality poured into the soul. So those three forms or stages of contemplation may hold intense interest, especially for serious meditators, but they also indicate the depths that contemplation plumb. It's not just a light thing by any means. There are also stages of contemplation itself. I'd like to share one more description of contemplation by J.J. Vanderloo, who said it's only when the cup of our being has been emptied of personality that it can be filled with the wine of our divine life. And when this life is first experienced in meditation, it's like entrance into a new world, no longer one of appearances, of phenomena, but one of consciousness, one in which we are identified with that which we desire to know. So there is this complete identification with something else. Self just disappears completely. We're now going to turn to the second question of this presentation, which is, what does it mean to adopt a contemplative life? It is self-evident that, practically speaking, it is not possible to function in the everyday world while at the same time being in a permanent state of contemplation or samadhi. We actually require a sense of subject and object experienced through our personal vehicles in order to go about our daily business. However, it's possible for an individual with genuine spiritual inclinations to adopt a more contemplative life, generally speaking. So perhaps we can say that a contemplative life is a life which is thoughtful, a life which is reflective, allows time for reflection, and which makes time for introspection on life's deeper questions and meaning. We are self-determining by nature. The Manasic principle is a precious gift, quickened long ago by the Manasaputras, who are said to have incarnated in the then young humanity to awake or quicken the mind. This mind has breadths and depths which we have yet to traverse. And with this mind, around which our higher evolution in fact turns, we most certainly have the ability to intelligently consider what kind of life we want to live. What kind of life do we want to live? It may be easy to drift along from year to year without a great deal of awareness, and yet it is perfectly possible for the person who functions in the everyday world, somebody who is not in a cloistered community, to live in a more contemplative way. But this, of course, may require some change. Meaningful change, I would suggest, is possible for any person at any age. Quite often one hears people say, well, people don't change. Maybe many people don't change. Maybe some people do change. Change is possible. So, is it possible to give deep consideration to just how we are living our lives now, and whether this is fully aligned with our deepest moral principles? This is one of many areas that deserve reflection. So there are a few words about what it might mean to adopt a contemplative life. But how is it possible to live more contemplatively in the everyday world? Now we come to the how question, which, as mentioned before, is very important. If we were constantly in a state of deep contemplation, it would be very difficult to deal with the numerous mundane aspects of daily living. But what we can do is learn how to live in a way which is more thoughtful, in a way which is not constantly driven by desires, not constantly driven by the dictates of the world, not constantly driven by the rush and the bustle of human affairs. And so it requires us to look at our lives as impartially as possible, to conduct a self-audit, if you like. So let's recall a number of hints that have already come up in the points made before in terms of how to live more contemplatively in the everyday world. Let us return first of all to pratyahara, using that description by Venerable Samdong Rinpoche, living an ordinary routine life, which is also a preparation for meditation. Now, this might seem to be very dull, but in fact it may be a remarkably full and rich life. There may be a great deal going on underneath the surface. Secondly, learning to concentrate. Hold the mind to a single idea at will, and when concentration wanders, to learn to return to the breath. This also helps us to reorientate our lives in such a way that it is easier to live a more contemplative kind of life. Remember, in the stage of meditation, that stage of dhyana, this engages the intuitional activities of mental life. Our president spoke about the intuitive mind a couple of days ago. After reviewing a problem, for example, is it possible to simply lift it into silence? Is there anyone here who's never had a problem? No hands are going up. Is it possible to simply lift a problem into silence, to empty the mind, so that problem solving, some insight to help with a problem, can be allowed to infuse the consciousness from a deeper level? That is another aspect of contemplative living, how we actually deal with problems from day to day. And then we come to contemplation. Here I'm going to share 4 comments by Brother David Steindl-Rast, the well-known Benedictine monk, about contemplative living. First of all, he mentioned that by using the term contemplative life, this does not mean life in a cloister, does not mean a fully secluded life. He said, as a vocation, it refers to a particular form of life in which, ideally at least, every detail of daily living is oriented towards recollection. Now, that may be a rather tall order, but even if some of the details of daily living can be oriented towards recollection, then we will be living a more contemplative kind of life. He talked about living in a mindful way, and this is very practical everyday advice. For example, closing doors mindfully, turning off lights when we leave a room, treating books with reverence. In primary school, I had a teacher, a library teacher, and one of the first things he taught us was, if you have a new book, you need to open it in a number of places spaced out so that the spine does not break. And that's something that remained in my mind for the rest of my life, really. And that's really mindful treatment of a book. He also, Brother David Steindl-Rast, talked about not letting the tap drip and placing a pair of sandals neatly. These are all little things, but they can help in this kind of more contemplative life. Then he talked about solitude as an integral part of the contemplative tradition. We may not live in a monastery, but are we comfortable with being alone at times? And this does not mean being alone at home with the television on or some music on or something like that, but just alone and quiet, without external noise. Some people may fear this, but solitude can be very centering, very refreshing, tremendously fulfilling, in fact. It literally invites us to stop and to step out of the daily rush for a while. He also spoke about that term in the Christian tradition, voluntary poverty, which he explained not as giving up things, but rather as partly an exercise in detachment and partly an exercise of detachment. To him, detachment did not mean stripping ourselves of possessions, but stripping ourselves of selfishness. So allowing the self to subside, that whole personal nature, so that we function in a different way from a deeper level. So, just to summarise these few practical hints to this point, a calm, routine life can help one live in a more contemplative way. Learning to hold the mind to a single idea, and when it wanders, bringing one's consciousness back to the breath. Learning to solve problems intuitively, lifting a problem to a higher level, letting the machinations of the mind just drop, and allowing some insight to emerge in its own time. Orientating daily life towards recollection and living in a mindful way in the little things of life as well. Deliberate periods of silent solitude. And perhaps even in a busy week of an individual, a few moments can actually be dedicated for this purpose. And he also spoke of voluntary poverty, stripping ourselves of selfishness, in effect, becoming humble, living simply. So one can build a delicately balanced, more contemplative life. It's quite possible to do this. I'd like to add one more point to those which have already been mentioned. And that is the necessity of dwelling regularly on things that matter, things of profound significance, such as the fact of impermanence, the purpose of our life. What is that purpose? Has it perhaps become clearer to us as time has gone on? What is of ultimate importance and what is not? What does relationship mean? These are important questions. They're things that require time to dwell upon them. And who we are now, and who perhaps we aspire to become, possibly inspired by some of the great sages throughout history. So, it is possible to live more contemplatively in the modern world, and some ways of doing this have been considered this morning. Lama Govinda said that what opens the mind to the great mystery of life, to the infinite within, not behind the infinite, to the eternal within the ephemeral, is the sense of wonder. Did you ever, as a child, have a tremendous sense of wonder at something? Have you ever looked at little children who see something for the first time? They are absolutely almost entranced. There's something so special about it. They may be looking at a tiny insect, or perhaps the vastness of the sky. This has a kind of innocence about it, a sense of wonder. There is no egocentricity in the sense of duality when wonder is present. This sense of wonder, said Lama Govinda, is what gives depth to our experience and vision of the world. It is the background without which the experience of freedom would not be possible, the starting point of every spiritual activity. So he was talking about the sense of wonder as being the starting point of every spiritual activity. Indeed, this sense of wonder is an excellent beginning as we learn to contemplate life ever more deeply, only to become filled with the wine of our divine life, to use Vanderloo's terminology. And finally, a contemplative life can begin with the way in which we choose to live right now. We can actively mould ourselves like artists by creating a vessel through which our deepened nature may manifest. A contemplative mind is a beautiful, cultured mind, and a contemplative life is a thing of the most exquisite grace.
Thank you, Linda, for a wonderful talk. Enjoy. This is break time, I guess. Yeah, coffee break, and we'll come back half an hour's time.